Who doesn't dream of basking in the morning sun while water splashes your feet as you read Paulo Coelho while sipping some piña colada on your private island? Seems like China lives by this idea. Not holidaying on a beach, but owning an island all to themselves. No harm done, right? After all, what could be wrong with having an island? Many countries own islands, and there are many others who are just islands in themselves. Well, owning an island is one thing, but creating one on a sea sounds weird and fishy. Let's start with a background of country borders here, because, hello, a border can change the course of water. Well, that was a joke, and I guess a bad one. Anyway, according to the UN Law of Seas, a country's territorial borders extend 200 nautical miles from its shore, and this area is called the country's exclusive economic zone. Going by this, any natural resources found in the EEZ area belongs to the country only. Okay, now any area that doesn't fall in any country's EEZ is termed as international waters, which is open to all. Most countries follow this rule, except China, of course. Well, they believe they have historical claims and have marked their border vaguely by the 9-dash line. Now this historic border takes about 90% of the South China Sea. You can well understand that this wasn't well received by other countries. This is a valuable trade passage and fishing ground for all neighboring countries like Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. After all, it is incredibly rich in natural resources, replete with 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and over 10% of the world's fisheries. Another important thing is that 30% of world trade flows through this passage of the South China Sea. Claiming them entirely obviously meant trouble with the neighbors. Next, we come to the Spratly Islands, a cluster of barely inhabited and remote islands which are both symbolically and geographically the heart of the South China Sea. They're claimed by Vietnam, China, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The important point here is that any country that can claim these islands will be in a position to extend their EEZ to include a large chunk of surrounding waters. Though all these countries have created ports and buildings on these small islands to claim their portion, China believes the Spratly Islands belong to them. You guessed it, didn't you? This is exactly where the roots of this dispute are hidden, but the matter escalated rather quickly from here. China has been actively directing their efforts towards building man-made bases over some of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea since 2014. This doesn't sound so good. In March 2017, the Center for Strategic and International Studies confirmed the completion of a Chinese man-made island named as the Fiery Cross Island. The interesting thing is that it didn't even exist 2 years ago. Wow! It used to be nothing more than a mass of rocks and coral reef. Guess how it looks now? This 1 square mile island is host to a 10,000-foot airstrip, basketball and tennis courts, running tracks, buildings, and whatnot. That's China for you. The U.S. estimates that China has added 3,200 acres of land on 7 features over the past 3 years. Now that is shocking. They have used reefs and rock to their advantage for constructing these islands. They have created the base by piling up sand on the reef, adding a thick layer of rocks to it, and then a layer of cement to the first 2. They basically used the principle used by Dubai to create Palm Islands. Smart, we should say. But where did the enormous amounts of sand come from that was required for these islands? Well, they ground the materials on seabed and turned it into fine sand. You guessed it right, they were slammed for causing irreparable harm to the marine environment. Sad, but we gotta focus on something else. They can create land out of nowhere, that too on sea. But that is not the scary bit. Wait for it. According to China, the islands are being created for navigation purposes, and the lighthouses erected on them will help ships to know their way around the corals. How noble! Once you are ready to ditch those awestruck expressions that made their way to your face after hearing about China's accomplishment, know that it isn't all positive. While these islands have navigational benefits, many of them are now evidently military bases. Can you believe that? The Fiery Cross Island itself is replete with an advanced radar station, missile system, and 200 troops. Since China claims the Spratly Islands entirely, creating these man-made islands are a sign that they are willing to use force to defend such claims. It gets scarier and scarier. This is where the U.S. steps in. Even though it has no claim in the South China Sea, being a superpower, it tries to defend international waters. So when a U.S. destroyer ship sailed 12 miles from the coast of one of these man-made islands, China sent out a patrol boat and a destroyer to warn them of their intrusion. The reason China has built these islands is because they will function as naval bases. The more islands they create, the more ships they can support, and thus the more area they can take control of. They have been deploying their ships and fishing boats some 150 miles from the Philippines, thereby restricting trade to the country. This they have termed the cabbage strategy. Though China has taken one step at a time so that no major conflicts arise, other countries aren't taking this and are thus arresting trespassers in waters that they claim. This may be good for them, but China plans to step ahead by declaring an air identification zone above the South China Sea, which would mean that any aircraft flying above it would need permission from China. Though this has not yet happened, you never know. So when China claims that their intentions are not militaristic, it would be hard to believe after such actions. Other countries are also taking action by increasing troops around their territory. We can only hope that these conflicts do not get ugly, but going by the present situation, we're doubtful. What are your views on China's new man-made islands? Tell us in the comment section below.
This is the guided missile cruiser USS Antietam, and on Sunday, it and another American warship sailed near the South China Sea islands claimed by Beijing. 2 U.S. officials told Reuters of the maneuver near the Parcel Island chain, which could anger Beijing just as U.S. President Donald Trump seeks China's continued cooperation with the denuclearization of North Korea. While this operation was planned months in advance, and similar operations have become routine, it comes at a particularly sensitive time. Satellite photos taken on May 12th showed China appeared to have deployed surface-to-air or anti-ship missiles on one of the islands. The U.S. military did not comment on Sunday's maneuvers, called freedom of navigation operations. The South China Sea islands are disputed by several nations, including Vietnam and the Philippines. About $5 trillion in shipborne trade passes through the South China Sea every year. The Pentagon has long complained that China has been building up its military presence in the region and constructing artificial islands that could be used as strategic operations bases.
Now let's take a look at stories making headlines around the world. And China has lashed out at the United States after 2 U.S. warships sailed near contested islands in the South China Sea. For more on this and other international news, let's turn to our Noah Adam. So Adam, another furious response from Beijing over the US Navy's so-called freedom of navigation exercise.
That's right, Mark. This issue has been an ongoing sticking point between the two countries. The Higgins, a guided missile destroyer, and the Antietam, a guided missile cruiser, reportedly sailed 12 nautical miles off the Paracel Islands on Sunday. They are a group of islands and reefs in the northern part of the disputed waters of the South China Sea and are contested by China and its neighbours. This forced China to send its own warships to the area to warn the American vessels to leave. Other details about the encounter were not immediately known. Beijing's defense ministry called the US Navy's move a provocation and accused them of violating China's sovereignty. In a separate statement, China's foreign ministry urged Washington to stop such actions. The US did not immediately respond to Sunday's statements, but it has continuously defended its operations in the disputed waters. Washington has insisted that its Navy conducts regular freedom of navigation operations around the world, including in areas claimed by allies, and that they are separate from political considerations. The latest operation comes at a sensitive time in US and China relations, especially when they are both working on avoiding a potential trade war between them. Ties have also been strained due to President Trump's cancellation of the summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
In a statement on Sunday, China's Air Force has landed bombers on islands and reefs in the South China Sea as part of a training exercise in the disputed region. The statement said that the People's Liberation Army Air Force recently organized multiple bombers such as the H-6K to conduct takeoff and landing training on islands and reefs in the South China Sea. In response, the United States dispatched warships to disputed areas of the South China Sea in a bid to challenge China's extensive territory claim.
And China, for the first time, landed its bombers on the disputed islands in the South China Sea, triggering warnings from Washington. The move comes as a part of a training exercise in the disputed region. A Chinese H-6K bomber has also conducted assault training on a designated sea target and then carried out takeoffs and landings at an airport in the area. The Chinese Air Force has described the exercise as preparations for a battle for the South China Sea. In a statement, the Chinese Air Force said, and I quote, "A division of the People's Liberation Army Air Force recently organized multiple bombers such as the H-6K to conduct takeoff and landing trainings on islands and reefs in the South China Sea in order to improve our ability to reach all territory, conduct airstrikes at any time and strike in all directions." Meanwhile, the United States has dispatched warships to disputed areas of the South China Sea in a bid to challenge China's extensive sovereignty claims in the territory, which is subject to various claims by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Brunei and Malaysia.
All part of the training exercise last week. Several bombers, including the most advanced H-6K, landed and took off from islands and reefs in the South China Sea. The PLA didn't specify which islands, but military experts believe it was Yongxing Island, which is also home to the administrative headquarters of the Sanxia City government. The latest exercise is believed to have elevated Air Force ability of, quote, reaching its full territorial assaulting in full time and space and striking in full scope.
This training marks another significant step of our bombers accessing all areas and launching all-around attacks at any time. Taking off and landing on islands and reefs is no longer a tough task.
But military commentators said the next mission for the long-range H-6K strategic bomber might be to land on China's farthest outlying artificial islands. It has a reported combat range of up to 3,500 kilometers. The Philippine presidential spokesman, Harry Roque, said that Manila couldn't independently verify the presence of Chinese bombers in the South China Sea, but he says Manila has serious concerns. In a written statement, Harry Roque says, quote, "We are taking the appropriate diplomatic action necessary to protect our claims and will continue to do so in the future." Manila does stop short of condemning China's action after President Duterte conceded that the Philippines was powerless to stop Beijing's exercises in the South China Sea. The Pentagon, on the other hand, condemned the exercise, calling it a move of militarizing the South China Sea. China's foreign ministry offered this rebuttal.
South China Sea islands are China's territory. Relevant trainings are normal and routine trainings of the Chinese military. Therefore, it's unnecessary for other parties to unscramble it too much. As for the U.S. saying of the so-called militarizing the South China Sea, I think what we are doing is completely different from flying its warships and aircraft from thousands of miles away to this region to make threats to other countries.
Well, Lookout was clearly referring to U.S. Navy itself for frequently sending warships and aircraft carriers to patrol the area. The PLA said the latest exercise was a direct response to the U.S. Air Force flying B-52 bombers there during what Washington called a routine training mission.
China hypersonic bomber plane landing in South China Sea, Philippines comprising diplomatic action. Manila, the Philippines is in action by taking diplomatic action to affirm its territorial claims in the South China Sea after China's H-6K bombers landed in the disputed region. The diplomatic action step was announced by the Foreign Ministry in Manila on Monday, the 21st of May 2018. Beijing Air Force itself has admitted several bomber aircraft such as H-6K have landed and took off from the islands and coral reefs in the South China Sea as part of training last week. Beijing's military action sparked protests by opposition lawmakers in Manila. The United States also sent ships to the area in question. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines admits that it is monitoring progress. We are taking the appropriate diplomatic measures necessary to protect our territory and will continue to do so in the future, the ministry said in a statement. We reaffirm our commitment to protect every inch of our territorial and sovereign territory, the statement said. Nevertheless, President Rodrigo Duterte's government does not want to comment on the actions of China, which Washington perceived could trigger protests in the region. China claims almost the entire South China Sea, a strategic waterway that generates $3 trillion of world ship traffic each year. Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam also have conflicting claims in the region. China has built 7 artificial islands in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea and turned them into military posts with airfields, radar, and missile defense systems. Beijing says its military facilities at Spratly are purely defensive and deserve to do what is liked in its own territory.
They're trying to move their nuclear equipment closer to the United States. This is a perfect example. This week, the Chinese moved their H-6 bombers to their islands in the South China Seas. Why? This is hundreds of miles away from their main island, from the main country of China. They're in the South China Sea that doesn't belong to them, like a bunch of pirates. They have taken over that whole area, okay? And now they're moving their bombers there. What it is now, they're getting the bombers, their H-6 bombers are now getting closer and closer to the U.S., okay, where they don't have to refuel or anything like that, and they can do a first strike. This weapon can be considered a first strike weapon, okay, because the bombers, as long as they're international water, the U.S. can't do much about it. But who's to say that they have enough bombers one day to catch us with our pants down, okay? This is what the whole deal is. They're going to move these bombers also to South America. They'll move the bombers also to Central America. They'll do it possibly in the next, and it could be anything between, a couple of months or a couple of years, depending on how the negotiation go in the Caribbean and South America and Central America, for them to start building their bases and putting in their bombers. Also, their Navy vessels will have the capability to carry nuclear warheads, and they will station those only a couple hundred miles away or even less, okay, from the U.S. This is the whole idea of the communists get closer to the United States for a first strike. You see, the U.S., the Chinese communists have figured out that if they were to launch, let's say, against U.S. troops, let's say in the Gulf area, such as in the Middle East or in Asia area, they're better equipped to stop rockets and missiles, okay? But if you move in Chinese assets close to the United States, such as bombers and ships carrying nuclear weapons and submarines, and you move them closer, and you have enough troops and enough equipment in that area, enough assets, what you do is you can make a first strike, a surprise strike, okay? And the U.S. will not have enough time to react to bring that equipment to bring down all those nuclear missiles, incoming missiles, into the U.S. We will not have enough time to react. There are no Patriot batteries along anywhere almost in the U.S. We don't have enough counter missile. They're mostly deployed overseas and trouble areas such as the Middle East. Maybe, if you think about it, maybe the whole idea of starting so much problems in the Middle East is for us to deploy our assets, okay, our anti-missile batteries overseas and leave the U.S. naked from incoming nuclear missiles, and the Chinese are now setting it up, getting closer to the U.S. The U.S. should have we should have Patriot style missiles, because now they upgrade to new systems. Those kind of defenses should be peppering the entire U.S. coast. All along the borders of all areas, we should have those, like if it was in the 1960 or 1950, when we were at the height of, getting in the Cold War with Russia. We have anti-missiles and AAA and different type of missiles in different parts of the United States, and little by little throughout the years, we took them out. We're almost naked in the U.S. Look, we can stop a plane probably from coming in and blow it out of the sky. We'll have enough time probably to hit a plane. But when you have missiles, ballistic missiles at close range being fired into the U.S., we're not going to be able to stop it. And the Chinese know that. The only way to stop them is you have to have the kind of systems that we have deployed to the Middle East, and they have to be up and ready. We used to have bases all over the U.S. We need to rearm those bases with anti-missile weapons, okay? In case the Chinese one day were to launch a freaking surprise attack against the U.S.
As trade tensions mount, China is conducting massive military drills in the South China Sea while U.S. carriers are sailing by. About 40 Chinese warships practicing in the live fire exercises, including its own refurbished Soviet-era carrier. China has laid claim to nearly 90% of that busy Asian waterway.
We've expressed consistent concern about militarization of the South China Sea.
On the Pentagon's decision or disinvitation of Chinese military in the RIMPAC exercise, we find that a very non-constructive move. It's also a decision that's taken lightly. It's unhelpful to mutual understanding between China and the U.S. We hope the U.S. will change such a negative mindset. On the so-called militarization in the South China Sea, we talked about this issue just now. China is only building civilian and some necessary defense facilities on our own islands. That is the right to self-defense and preservation of every sovereign state.
Washington's decision to disinvite Beijing to international naval drills over what it called the militarization of the South China Sea is unlikely to affect China's policy with regard to the disputed maritime region, analysts told Sputnik. stressing that the US move has followed a truce in the US-China tariff war. The US withdrawal of an invitation to China for the 2018 Rim of the Pacific exercise, RIMPAC, under the pretext of Beijing's construction activities in the South China Sea clearly demonstrates the unscrupulousness of Washington's goals, says Shen Shishun, the director of the China Institute of International Affairs Center for South Pacific Studies. China is operating exclusively within the confines of its sovereignty in the South China Sea, Shen told Sputnik China. Undoubtedly, Beijing carries out both earthworks on reefs and military exercises within the framework of the protection of the country's sovereignty. The US does not want to understand this. Additionally, China's joint exercises with other countries or international organizations are conducted to bolster mutual trust, partnership, and cooperation, to develop military contacts and exchanges and ensure transparency in the military sphere. In contrast, Washington is striving to demonstrate that it is the only actor that brings justice to the region, the scholar noted, adding that the invitation withdrawal is just a pretext to exert further pressure on China. Still, Shen believes that the effort is futile. China remains confident, he said. Its actions aimed at protecting national sovereignty are consistent and firm. Russian political analyst Alexander Lomanov echoes Shen. Regardless of whether China will participate in these RIMPAC maneuvers or not, the Chinese policy in regard to the South China Sea and the protection of its fundamental interests will not change in any way. The analyst presumed that Beijing's behavior could become even more decisive. In any event, it is unlikely that China would make any political or military concessions in the wake of the invitation withdrawal. I believe that China took enough compromise steps during the trade negotiations last week, Lomanov said. The US will obviously try to exert further pressure on China. However, Beijing's Realpolitik indicates that it does not intend to relinquish its fundamental interests regardless of any pressure. On Wednesday, the US Department of Defense announced that it would not invite the People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, to participate in the US-led RIMPAC drills that bring together over 20 nations including Australia, India, Japan, and the United Kingdom every 2 years. As an initial response to China's continued militarization of the South China Sea, we have disinvited the PLA Navy from the 2018 Rim of the Pacific, RIMPAC, exercise, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Logan, a Pentagon spokesman, stated. In response, China's defense ministry said that Washington had ignored the facts and hyped up the so-called militarization of the South China Sea. This decision by the United States is not constructive. Closing the door to communication at any time is not conducive toward promoting mutual trust and communication between the Chinese and US militaries, the ministry emphasized. For his part, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi dubbed the decision as unconstructive while speaking at a joint press conference with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Washington. We find that a very unconstructive move. It's unhelpful to mutual understanding between China and the US. We hope the US will change such a negative mindset. Wang pointed out that China places civilian and some necessary defense facilities on its own islands, citing the country's right to self-defense. This is an ordinary deployment, it has nothing to do with militarization, the minister underscored, highlighting that China is doing it on a much smaller scale compared to the US activities in Hawaii or the island of Guam. The decision to disinvite China to the naval drills was taken on the heels of the preliminary trade agreement made by Washington and Beijing on May 19. The two parties agreed to halt the ongoing tariff war. However, a few days later, Larry Kudlow, the director of the National Economic Council under U.S. President Donald Trump, signaled that tariffs were not completely off the table. Ankit Panda of The Diplomat noted that the Department of Defense chose to describe it as part of an initial response, suggesting that the administration may follow up with a series of other moves. The RIMPAC disinvitation should not be seen in a vacuum, the Observer argues. It comes at a time of considerable uncertainty in US-China ties, and it remains clear that despite the recent thaw in the brewing trade war, relations between Beijing and Washington are poised for a significant period of turbulence.
In a span of 20 minutes,
20 F-18 fighter jets took off and landed on the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, in a powerful display of military precision and efficiency. The nuclear-powered warship, leading a carrier strike group, was conducting what the U.S. military called routine training in the disputed South China Sea on Tuesday, headed for a port call in the Philippines, a defense treaty ally. The United States is not alone in carrying out naval patrols in the strategic waterway, where Chinese, Japanese and some Southeast Asian navies operate, possibly increasing tensions and risking accidents at sea. We have seen Chinese ships around us, Rear Admiral Steve Kohler, the strike group commander, told a small group of reporters on board the 3-decade-old carrier. They are one of the navies that operate in the South China Sea, but I would tell you that we have seen nothing but professional work out of the ships we have encountered. Navies in the Western Pacific, including China and 9 Southeast Asian countries, have been working on a code of unexpected encounters, QUEs, at sea to avoid conflict. The USS Theodore Roosevelt's presence in the South China Sea comes days after China's massive air and naval drills in the area, in what some analysts described as an unusually large display of Beijing's growing naval might. China's growing military presence in the waters has fueled concern in the West about Beijing's endgame. The United States has criticized China's apparent militarization of man-made islands and carried out regular air and naval patrols to assert its right to freedom of navigation in stretches of a sea China claims largely as its own. This transit in the South China Sea is nothing new in our planning cycle or in a reaction to that. It is probably by happenstance that all of that is happening at the same time, said Kohler, who gave a tour of the carrier to Philippine military officials and watched flight operations aboard the 100,000-ton warship. All of the operations that we do in and around the South China Sea or any of the bodies of water we operate in, there is a function of international law, and that is ultimately what we want to recognize, Kohler said. Tension between the United States and China over trade and territory under U.S. President Donald Trump has been stepped up of late, with fear in the region that the South China Sea, vital to global trade, could one day become a battleground between the two rival powers. Philippine ties with China have meanwhile warmed under President Rodrigo Duterte, who has put aside disputes with Beijing and wants it to play a key role in building and funding urgently needed infrastructure, from highways and ports to railways, and power plants. China has long objected to U.S. military operations off its coasts, even in areas Washington insists are free to international passage. They, China, certainly have the right to exercise off their coast like we do, nor are they necessarily in charge of our transit cycle, but our deployment's been planned, Kohler said. As the crew in color-coded uniforms race to service dozens of aircraft taking off and landing, handlers in the flight deck control made sure the deck had enough room for jets to maneuver and refuel with the help of a Ouija board. The board has all the models of each aircraft, which are marked with squadron name, model, make, and number of personnel. At any given moment, the flight deck is home to dozens of aircraft and helicopters. It is a showcase of the capability of the U.S. Armed Forces, Philippine Army Chief Rolando Bautista said of the demonstration. Since Americans are our friends in one way or another, they can help us deter any threat.